Last week, we talked about whether suffering disproves God. And I believe I gave you an adequate answer for that. But here's how things normally go. Usually someone brings up something they have against God, or they say, well, what about this? Doesn't this disprove God? And then even if you give an answer, then the follow-up is, well, I don't actually have to prove that God doesn't exist. You would have to prove that God exists. And they actually have a point there. We can observe and experiment on nature and everything around us. All of the natural world around us, we can use the scientific method on. And yet we believe in a supernatural God that can't be experimented on in the same way. So we kind of do have the burden of proof to prove that God exists. And luckily enough, we have a few really good arguments, and I'm going to briefly mention two of them, and then I'm going to go into depth on the third one. So before I get into that, I need to say, you are not going to argue someone into the kingdom of God. 99.9% of people are not going to be persuaded by even the best possible argument. Either their brains just don't work that way, like they're just not a logical thinker, or there are enough reasons they have against God that they're just not going to be persuaded. So that actually brings me to the first argument. The first argument is the experiential argument. And that argument just says, well, I have experienced God in my life, so I know that God is true. And the strength of that, the first strength is they can't argue against you. The second strength of that is that this is how people come to know God. People are not persuaded by arguments, they're persuaded by an experience with God. They encounter God, and then that changes their life, and now they know from experience that He's true. So just realize, like, hey, don't discount your experience. Sharing your experiences with God is a powerful argument, and it also helps teach people what the faith is all about. So the first argument is the experiential argument. The second argument is the moral argument. And I'm just going to put this very briefly. I could do a whole series of videos on this. The moral argument says that our sense of good and evil, or wrong and right, has to have a source. So we can't just come to this idea of morality and all agree on morality without it having some kind of source. And the source itself has to be something good. So there has to be some good being that gave us our sense of morality, and that comes from God. That's not saying that people can only be good if they know God. That's saying that God built morality into the universe, into existence. So the whole reason Christians and non-Christians alike can agree that there are things that are good and there are things that are evil is because a good being built that into the fabric of the universe. Again, there's far more complexity to that, but I just want you to be aware of that argument as well as the experiential argument. But the argument I want to spend time on with you is called the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam is just the name of the guy who originally developed this. It is the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Cosmological refers to the beginning of things, the beginning of the cosmos, the beginning of the universe. So the Kalam cosmological argument goes like this. There are two premises and then a conclusion. That's how a lot of arguments go. So it says, everything that began to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, that seems straightforward, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain this step by step. So premise one is, everything which began to exist has a cause. And I think we instinctually know that this is true. A chair, I'm sitting on a stool right now, you might be sitting on a chair, or maybe you're sitting on a chair in a car or walking around, whatever. But chairs, we know, don't just spring to existence. Every chair in the world was brought into being by something. It was formed out of something. It has a cause. The beginning of the existence of that chair has a cause. Someone took the wood or took the metal, shaped it, boom, we have a chair. We're not walking down the street and then suddenly, poof, a chair is on the sidewalk in front of us that wasn't there before. You don't have things just springing into being out of nothing. So, chairs have a beginning. You can kind of think of it like dominoes. This chair began to exist, therefore it had a cause. Someone created that chair. And then that person who created the chair also had a cause. And that person also had a cause. So then the universe itself, now this is the premise 2, it says that the universe began to exist. And I think we can all agree on this. Christians who believe in young earth would say that the earth began, some few thousand years ago. Christians, old earth creationist Christians would say that it began billions of years ago, and evolutionists would say it began billions of years ago. We can all agree that the universe had a beginning. And in fact, the Big Bang Theory arose because we realized the universe was expanding. And if it's expanding, that means that we can map out, if we understand acceleration, we can map out at what point all of matter and energy was at the same place, the same point in space and time. So we know that the universe began to exist, and therefore the conclusion follows that the universe itself has a cause. And that just gets us to the fact that something or someone created the universe. But let's talk a little bit, because here are some questions I imagine arising. So, what about God? So if you explain this argument to someone, I imagine the first question they have is, well, what about God? If the universe began to exist and everything that began to exist has a cause, then, well, doesn't God have a cause? And, well, the answer is no. God is eternal. God being eternal means that God has no beginning and no end. The fact that God doesn't have a beginning means God didn't begin to exist. And the argument specifically says everything which began to exist, not everything that exists. God never began to exist, therefore God doesn't have to have a cause. Before the universe began, God existed eternally with no beginning in a timeless state. God was timeless. So, what about God? Does God have a beginning? Does God have a cause? No. God is eternal. God was timeless before the universe existed. Now I believe God is experiencing time along with us. But yeah, God does not have a beginning. So God does not have a cause. Okay, well then, why can't the universe be eternal? Why does the universe have to have a beginning? And I actually first encountered this argument reading A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, where he suggested that maybe the universe was just kind of like big banging and then would contract and then continue on for an eternity. Well, Stephen Hawking pointed out the problem with this, and it's a pretty big one, is if the universe is infinite, meaning the universe had no beginning, it just infinitely existed before this point, then that means that an infinite number of moments existed before us. And what that actually means, there can't be an infinite number of moments before us, otherwise we would never come to exist now. And I know this is complex, and your brain is hurting a little bit, but we understand infinity moving forward. So if time is infinite, we believe that because we're believers, we're going to live forever, meaning we're going to live for an infinite amount of time. What that means is we're never going to get to the end of time because it's infinite. But if the universe never began to exist, if it infinitely existed before us, then that means that time could never get to us. We're, in essence, at the end of time, So time would never reach us. So we would never exist. Now, if that is still confusing, just believe me that philosophers agree this is an issue. If time infinitely existed before us, then we would never come to the moment where we are existing right now. Okay, so then the next question I foresee there is, well, if an infinite amount of time before us is a problem, then what about God? If God existed infinitely, God had no beginning, then doesn't that present the same problem that we would just never come to this moment? We would have never come to the moment when God created the universe? Well, it's important that I earlier said before the universe began, God was timeless. That meant God didn't experience this moment in time and then this moment in time and then this moment in time. And it's hard to describe what a timeless existence would look like, but we've, as Christians, believed that for over a millennium now, that God was timeless. So if God was timeless, then that means there wasn't an infinite amount of time. Time didn't exist before the universe. Time began to exist with the universe. So no, actually, God's eternity doesn't present the same problem. Just because God is infinite doesn't mean that there was an infinite amount of time before God created the universe. There was no time before God created the universe. The universe was the beginning of time. So then, I'm sure this is going to leave you with questions, and I am always available to talk about this. I wanted to keep this kind of simple. Feel free to drop some questions in the comments, and I will be active, and I will give the best answers I can. Also, feel free to talk to me on Sundays about this. Love talking about this kind of stuff. Again, there's so much more to this conversation, but I feel like just showing you the arguments and answering the most basic questions is as far as I wanted to go in this video, because I didn't want to leave you thinking like, well, I just don't want to pay attention to this. So I want to leave you there. I will leave you with this question. Well, if the universe began to exist, could something other than a God like the one we worship have created it, have caused it? And I would say we actually have a really good explanation for that, but that is for a topic for another video. So I will see y'all on Sunday.